Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that I was invited to do this, and I love talking about native plants. I love talking. So I will get right into my slideshow, and we're going to be talking about using native plants in our landscapes to bring in pollinators and wildlife and to enhance the natural beauty of our Northeast region. So bear with me one second. Okay, and I'm going to minimize this. Okay, great. All righty, so everybody can see the first slide, beneficial flowers in the landscape?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. So let's get started. All right, so we're going to start off just by talking about the basic principles and elements of design. So the principles are sort of the intangible items, and the elements are the things that we use to create the beauty that forms the intangibles. So we have texture and color. Those are the things that we put in ourselves, our flowers, our focal points, how we arrange them. We choose a color palette. All of these we use just like we would compose any other piece of art, right? Any other beautiful thing, we would use all these elements to create a pleasing picture. I love this picture, although I have no idea what proportion of this garden is native. But what I love about it is that this house, for one thing, is a beautiful house that sits across from the ocean on Martha's Vineyard. If you've ever visited, everybody probably has stopped to take a picture of this house. It's in Oak Bluffs. And if you noticed, if you were to look at this garden and say, well, what's a focal point? In this garden, the house is. The fretwork, the amazing work, you don't want to overpower, so you keep your garden in scale. You don't want to overpower the beauty of the house, so that the garden is more, it acts more like earrings or jewelry to this beautiful house, and that becomes the focal point. So when whoever created this beautiful garden, they composed it in a lovely but not overpowering way, so that the dominance goes to the house in a good way. But that's what we think about, right? When we're planning our garden in our homes, we think about how will this garden interact with our house. And what makes a great design, we just said, it's when the tangible elements connect with the intangible principles. They come together to form something pleasing and complementary. So if we look at this, which looks more like a CGI rendering to me, but we ask ourselves, if we were planning this garden, what's missing? And pretty much everything, right? It's a blank slate. So what we would wonder about is, how would we plan this garden? What would we want to see here? Are we planning a house on a busy street? Do those long windows face out onto a busy street, or do we want to enjoy the view and keep the plantings low? If you're sitting on the porch, if you're me, you're going to plant taller plants for privacy. But if you're in a friendly neighborhood where you like saying howdy neighbor all the time, then you would keep your plantings low. But it's a blank slate that's presented, and you can do with whatever you want based on how you're going to use the space, how you want the space to interact with the community, and how whomever lives in or visits your space needs to have mobility and access around the space. And if you notice, I want to point out that some of our modern day foundation plantings evolved out of a need to cover foundations. My house was built in the 60s, so it doesn't have a beautiful stone foundation like a lot of older homes has. It has it has a sort of a cinder blocky cement foundation, which growing up in my house, and in my neighborhood, all the little Cape Cod houses in my neighborhood all had taxus, the yews in front of them. In the spring, they had flowering azaleas. And then most of the summer, it was just green. So in this house here, if we look at this picture, maybe we wouldn't cover the foundation. Maybe we wouldn't need these huge plants to cover, because it looks like the siding is attractive and you would want to show it. But that's not always the case with foundation plantings. They came to not only protect from winds as a windbreak, but also to cover up ugly foundations. So here, what's missing? Well, almost everything, right? There's no contrast. there probably was, if this picture was taken in the summer, probably a few months ago, those look like azaleas. They might have been in bloom and they probably had added color, but now that the blooms have gone by, there's no contrast, right? The texture kind of all blends in. Everything looks pretty much the same. And what's the focal point? When we looked at the first big garden, the one with the beautiful house, well, the house was meant to be the focal point here. And this, I'm sure, is a lovely home in what looks like a suburban area, but you would maybe put something in the center there to draw out and make that garden, that foundation planting, look a little bit more appealing and interesting and draw your eye in. Now, I will confess, when I took this picture, I was taking a picture of a vegetable garden. I think this is in at Stonecrop, if I can remember. But anyway, it was a beautiful vegetable garden. But when I went back and looked at the picture, I couldn't remember what I was taking a picture of because it all kind of blended in together. There wasn't a clear focal point. If you look at it now, you might be drawn to what looks like a stand of cosmos here. But in all fairness, it's a vegetable garden. It looks like a vegetable garden when I was standing there. But if I were to be dissecting this as a planting, I would want to know what's missing. So there's not a lot of space in between the plants. Is there rhythm and harmony, something that might be done if you plant things in repetition? It creates a rhythm. If the colors are pleasing, they come together in a harmony. Is there balance? There's big things and little things, but they're kind of scattered around. Dominance, there was no focal point. And when I look at this picture now, but at the same time, there is something charming about it. I think it is the Cosmo arrangement or clump in the center. We might like this look and say, well, it just looks free and natural. But if you were planning a more formal garden, you would look to have those elements and principles a little bit more defined. So having talked about what makes a good design and bringing in elements and principles of design, you can do this all together and put a traditional garden look together or a carefree garden look together when you use native plants. Why bother? Because then you make the garden not only beautiful to you, but also beautiful to the pollinators and the wildlife who will be visiting and living in your garden. Something we should think about when we talk about native gardens also is that the beautiful butterflies and fuzzy bumblebees that we see flitting around in our garden all season long do not visit your garden. I have a tendency or had a tendency to say that. Look at the butterfly that visited my garden today. Chances are that little creature lives in your garden. So when we create these habitats, we are creating an outdoor home. Just as we're creating a beautiful garden, when we incorporate native plants, we are inviting pollinators, birds, other wildlife to live in our garden. And here's a picture that I snagged as proof of that. If you're looking around at the background, you as a gardener can probably tell that this is not a naturally occurring, although it is at the edge of a wooded area. It is a screening garden that sits behind a pool. But I've had ferns put in and some tall grasses, and there's clethra in the background and other native shrubs. And obviously you would not find a copper mermaid swimming around in a real garden. But who came to visit? This red-tailed hawk comes and visits this particular garden regularly, sits at the edge of the waterfall. Sometimes when the waterfall's turned on, he might put his feet in. But to the red-tailed hawk that before I put this garden in would just circle overhead, now he's a regular visitor every morning, or she. So we consider planting our native garden just like we would plan any other garden. We are just adding native plants to it. So we think about what this space is. This garden is a garden in White Plains. It's a beautiful, beautiful garden. It is chock full of, this is a plantaholic's dream garden. This is the backyard, and the garden just goes sort of uphill, terraced with steps, and you just love it. You just want to walk around. There's always something to look at. but there are little vignettes throughout the garden that draw your eye into each little space. You can see they mixed containers in, and so you can also tell by its positioning. This is a backyard garden off of a patio. So the garden is used to enhance the living space in the backyard. There could be privacy hedges also as well. So you consider when you're planning, am I doing a front yard or a backyard? Who'll see it? Will I see it from inside? Or do I have to be outside to see it? I'm a window person. I don't put a lot of curtains up in my house. And I would think if I lived here and this were perhaps a kitchen window over here, I would want to be able to see this all the time. So that sighting your garden is important. We can tell from the flowers, the vibrancy of the colors, that this probably gets a lot of sun, but we can also see tall trees. So part of it is in shade. So you think about the same things when you're sighting a native plant garden as you would a traditional garden, right? Every plant in its proper place. So this gardener, I'm sure this gardener and this homeowner is happy, but imagine how happy all the wildlife is when it comes to her space. So yes, we think about site conditions, right? The sun, shade, soil, if you needed a soil test, the health of the soil, do you need to amend anything? One of the beautiful things about native plants is that they tend to adjust. And that's true, that's the whole idea, right? If you plant something in the area in which it's evolved, it'll probably do better. If I took a tropical plant and planted it in the Northeast, I'd have to make sure it got enough water. I'd have to bring it in on cold days. It wouldn't survive a winter here. But when we plant the plants that belong here in our gardens are happier, healthier. They don't need pesticides and maintenance. So just like you would plant a regular garden, the right plant in the right space. So who visits you? Who uses your space? Once you've planted this, while you're planning this garden, you think about, will children be playing here? When we went back and we looked at this beautiful garden, this is my dream garden, but I wouldn't be able to put a jungle gym set in for my granddaughter. What would my granddaughter hear constantly when she went to go play, or she brought her friends over? She would constantly hear that back door opening and me yelling, don't step on my plants, don't step on my plants. So this might not be how you would plan a garden if you had children or grandchildren that you knew wanted to play. Do you know what plants are toxic to your dog or your cat? If your cat goes outside, chances are if you're planting a pollinator garden and inviting birds to your garden, you make your cat may be a house cat. But if you have dogs, do you know, you think of your plants, what's toxic to your pets? If you have someone with mobility issues, are the paths wide enough for a walker or a wheelchair? Is it flat enough for someone who's walking with a cane? You think about who's going to be using your space as you plan it. And then how are you going to be using the space? This is the garden where the hawk was sitting right here in the previous picture that I showed you. But this is a space that's meant to be enjoyed in many different ways. There's a fire pit over here. And when planning it, I thought, okay, I need a place that the chairs can sit flat. But I also want a grassy space so that if people or children want to sit in the grass, or if we want to be outside watching a movie, there's spaces to lay in the grass. Here along the edges of the jacuzzi, I didn't plant flowering plants, just grasses and some succulents, because I didn't want anyone sitting there to be bothered by bees as they sit there. The pollinator gardens are around the peripheral part of the garden so that the pollinators can be unbothered as well as guests. And me, I don't mind bees, but you know, sometimes at certain times of the year, yellow jackets show up and I didn't want them visiting flowers, and me too. And behind in the picture, which you can't see, is a barbecue grill. So the space had to accommodate all the functions that I needed within this defined space. But at the same time, I wanted to reduce the amount of hardscape as much as I could, as well as the amount of lawn in this particular space. I didn't want lawn mowers to have to come in here. So the idea was to create a soft natural feeling space and that worked for me and pollinators. So with a little planning and native plants, everyone can enjoy your space. It can be pleasing to humans and children as if they're different things, but sometimes children make you wonder, and pollinators that come to visit. So first, let's talk about who are you? What is your home? Is your home neat and traditional? A carefree garden may not look great in front of a brick Georgian home. You can certainly do it, but you might like something more traditional and neat. Or are you unstructured and carefree? What best defines your home as well as your personality? Your front of your house is almost like your face. It's the first thing that a person or a visitor sees when they approach, and it also sometimes sets the stage for what'll be inside. So your personality shows as well as it being welcoming to people. Well, both looks can be achieved with native plants. And here we have a mixed border in an urban area. So we have non-natives, variegated irises. This is lamb's ear. But in the back, rudbeckia plays in nicely. So when you're starting a native garden, especially from the beginning, sometimes you feel a little intimidated. You might feel like, well, I spent a lot on my landscaping, or I really labored over the beautiful landscape I have. Do I have to rip it all out now and put in natives, or I'm not a good person? I have found for my own self, as I became more aware of planting with natives and the benefits of it, that I was able to just bring in native plants slowly. And over time, I've realized that I fall in love with the benefits so much as not running my sprinkler system as much, to the butterflies that visit. I've counted so many different kinds of bees that visit the garden, the birds that hang out. So when we think about that, we bring in more and more and more, and little by little, I've transitioned my garden, but not all at once. So I like this picture because it does show a blend of both native and non-native, excuse me. And I like the texture of the brick wall. This is in the White Plains Public Library lot, which was an empty lot. Really a great use of an unused space. It was a barren cement lot that has recently been turned into a beautiful sensory pollinator garden. Within days of planting this garden, monarchs showed up. So, if you build it, they will come. And this garden now is family friendly. It has a lot of interactive features in it. And it shows the public the beauty of native plants, and also the beauty of taking a space that looks unloved and unused and making it something beautiful. These are basically, it's a giant container plant garden. And what I noticed when we went to the ribbon cutting, the White Plains Beautification held a pollinator pathway table at the ribbon cutting for this. The city was so proud of this garden. The people who came out, from the workers who helped build it to the mayor himself, the pride they took in doing something so beautiful for their community really resonated throughout the community. The population who came to the ribbon cutting, they just loved hearing about all the beauty that this garden and the benefits this garden provided in the middle of a very urban area. It's across the street. The garden faces the back of the old Galleria's parking lot. So it was really a beautiful use of space. So why do we plant natives? Why is it so important? Well, historic preservation and geographic preservation, a sense of place and a sense of space. This is the Northeast, and it is a beautiful area of the country. We're blessed with rainfall, and we're blessed with hardwood forest, oak trees. If you've ever had a chance to visit the Thane Family Forest down at NYBG, which is the last piece of the Bronx that was the original Bronx, it's a preserved piece of landscape that is really a salute to this area. We have rivers, we have fresh water. And so the plants that thrive here will be different than the plants that thrive in the Grand Canyon areas, the Midwest, the drier areas, or the ones that thrive down in Key West. It's a beautiful area that's blessed with 4 seasons most years. Some years it feels like we skip over fall and spring, but we are blessed with an evolutionary process of watching our gardens come into bloom. We start with our spring garden, it morphs into our summer garden, it slowly declines and mellows into our fall gardens and then sleeps. And the sleeping garden has a lot of beauty as well. So we want to pay homage to the area we live in. We want our yards to look like we live in the Northeast. You expect that when you come through our neighborhoods. And sometimes, while I do enjoy planting elephant ears or something pretty around my backyard patio to make me feel like I'm in the tropics, the reality is we are in the Northeast, and the plants that grow here and thrive here, we should preserve. Now, in preserving those plants, we also provide the ecological benefits to the birds, bees, and butterflies that have co-evolved with these plants. So we talk a lot about the bees and the butterflies, but our birds eat the caterpillars and the larvae. That's what they feed to their young. And if you've ever had the fun of watching a bird feed its young, you might notice robins will go and get worms. Of course, that's what we know, the robins, when the ground softens up and the robins reappear and we see them, cocking their head, and we don't know whether they're listening or looking, but then they dive right in and pull out a juicy worm. We know what they thrive on and how important a healthy soil is. But I had, and I'm sure this happens to many of us, I had a pair of nesting house wrens in my garage. Charming. They poop all over everything in my garage, but they come back every year and go into the garage. And I just watch the birds go back and forth, and they come back with the same little weird larva. It looks like gummy worms, but they're black and very tiny. And they keep coming back with mouthfuls of these things all day long. And I find myself wondering, well, how do I make sure they have enough? What do I need to plant? I don't want them to run out. Where are they getting them? What is it? So as I watch the wildlife and understand the whole cycle of life, we love to see the butterflies and all the little flittery things. But the truth is the birds rely on them as a food source as well. So when we don't provide the host plants for some of these worms and larvae, we also witness the decline of our bird population. So when we go native, we understand plant communities, a group of species constrained to an array of physical, chemical, and biological factors. That is a natural community. You'll find them if you walk through certain forests that are a little more undisturbed and more pristine. You'll notice some of the plants that we go out and buy just naturally occurring in little colonies, and they're growing with other plants that when we can access these plants, we can recreate these beautiful communities in our yard. And, it gives it a naturalistic setting, and it's what the pollinators and the wildlife are used to. And whether we're conscious of it or not, we are probably used to seeing that too. That's what our ancestors who were here for, plowing the land as farmers and whatever else, they might have been used to when they walked through the woods. So a woodland habitat is common here. It usually exists in layers: tree, canopy, shrub, understory, herbaceous ground covers. A meadow is another community of plants, and that's a very resilient. That's, I think, why we love meadow plantings. They're one of the most resilient plantings. You have to maintain them, but they do well with drought and they're tough. So when you bring plants together that have similar requirements, you are creating a community. When you bring native plants together, you are not only creating a community of flowers, you are creating and stabilizing a community of wildlife above and below the soil. Keep in mind, our healthy soils are extremely important to healthy gardens and a healthy environment. Now, I had to dig for a picture, so I thank the website of this landscaper. I want to make sure I give credit and cite the picture for a more traditional looking landscape using native plants. And it's beautiful. This is a very traditional looking house, and I feel that a traditional look has been pulled off with natives. But maybe you like unstructured and carefree. You like something that looks just relaxed. Whatever your style is, you can achieve the look, as I said before, with native plants. So let's look at a couple of challenges you might be familiar with. My front yard. I had this giant Norway maple for 20 odd years. So, which means if the house is, 60, that Norway maple has probably been there for 60 years. It is a city tree because it was 6 feet from the curb. And I've been trying to get it removed. First of all, it is failing. I had an arborist come out and look at it. It's failing. I've heard tree limbs fall from it on dry, clear days and come into the street. I have children walking through the neighborhood and bikers and families that take walks. I'm concerned about someone getting hurt. I had an arborist come out, certify that the tree was failing. And so the city finally came out and removed it. But a couple of things happened. First, I lost a tree, which is never, I didn't want to have to do. It also left my front yard feeling very bare. I've been wanting to take away some of this lawn, which isn't really lawn. It might look like that from a distance, but really it's just green weeds because I don't use any pesticides on it or herbicides on the lawn. So it's just green weeds. But what a good thing that happened is my front window where all of my house plants are, my house plants started doing better. And I thought, well, I really want some kind of garden to reduce the lawn, but I don't want to block the front window again. So I need a tree that supports wildlife, maybe a little better than a Norway maple. What to do? Here's my challenge. I'm finally getting the tree of my nightmares removed, but now I have to think about how I want the space replaced. So I brought in a border bed. This is a smaller, and this was put in last fall. This is a smaller Cercis canadensis, Eastern redbud. It is slightly offset because there are other trees in this corner. There's a magnolia and a linden tree on the corners of the property. So rather than putting this tree center, we offset a Cercis canadensis, which is a great host tree to different types of pollinators. I believe, was it the leaf cutter? It's not a bad thing. It might sound like it, a leaf cutter moth or larva or something. There's probably, I'm sure someone in here will tell me when I get finished what it is to host to, but it is one of the strong, most important host trees. I do have a river birch also on the edge of the property, and I noticed different things showing up when I planted that. So I thought another Cercis canadensis. It doesn't get huge. It won't block light. And then I'll add some smaller shrubs and plant a little pollinator border garden. So shrubs, small stature shrubs were brought in. And while it was planted in last October, I won't get to really enjoy it in its full bloom until this spring. But the main focal point of this little border is the Cercis canadensis, which, if you know, will get pink buds in the spring. I have some hydrangea arborescens here. We love hydrangeas. I love hydrangeas, but this is one that has the flowers are beneficial to pollinators. There's juniper, small, low-growing juniper, Symphora, which I always confuse with doll's eye, but that's not. It's we'll come back to it. I think it's called candy. Oh, I don't have my plant list, but anyway, it's a beautiful tree that gets white berries. Snowberry, that's what I'm thinking of. Snowberry. Aronia or red chokeberry is a smaller understory tree that's on the far corner. Hypericum, St. John's wort, right? Beautiful berries on that birds love. Physostegia, which is a perennial. Geranium maculatum, a ground cover that will continue to fill in so that so eventually it won't have a mulch showing, but the geranium will spread, and I can add into this garden and add other things to cover the ground. Agastache, great pollinator plant. and I love the purple vertical little spires. And this little blue stem, schizocarium. And that's just get some movement in there on this end where it gets a little full. You need some kind of movement and light to get through there. And the colors that it turns, that bluish burnished kind of hue that little blue stem takes on will add to that edge of the garden as well as bringing height among the low junipers. So I try to think of all the principles and elements, but all done with native plants. Here's another challenge. This is a small pocket garden that was overrun with Houtonia. And if you guys have ever had to deal with this chameleon plant, it is beautiful, but it forms an aggressive mat. I think it's 10 times worse than mint. It has an awful smell, and it works its way into everything. I believe the previous homeowners of this property probably planted it because it kept deer away. So nothing in this little pocket garden got eaten, but it wasn't terribly attractive to me either. So when I inherited this little tiny pocket garden, which sits in a corner outside of a kitchen window, I decided to do something about getting rid of this and reclaiming this space. Some of the plantings in there I love. It's got a tiny little red rose bush. I think it's pretty. They've had a butterfly bush there. I'm not going to rip it out. It's, you know, it's in the corner, it's in the back, but I can enhance it. So I started taking out the Houtonia. Now I've been battling it for going into year 3, 4, and going into year 4 now. And it's a constant battle. It works its way into the lawn. But in this space where you can see, I took out all of the aggressive Houtonia, and I put in coral bells, heuchera. And here I just put in plugs, small plugs all around the edges of it. I tried with some of the sedums, some of the native sedums, but they were no match for the Houtonia. The Houtonia just ran them over. And in pulling out the Houtonia, you pull out the sedums. So I went with something with a little bit, that the plant itself will get a little beefier. And as you can see, it starts to fill in. What I also added over here are a few Asclepia plants for monarchs. So I added in Asclepia incarnata and tuberosa, not a lot, maybe 2 or 3 plants of each, but I wanted to make it a little butterfly garden in this pocket because it is right outside of the kitchen window and it's in a protected space so nobody will bother it. More than anything, I wanted this space to be unbothered. Should the monarchs come, if they come, I don't want them to be harassed by everybody running by if they decide to lay eggs or people coming and going. The area is pretty quiet. Nobody really goes on that side of the property. So you can see it starts to fill in here. It's getting bigger. Now, this is actually at the end of the season. You'll see how tiny the Asclepia tuberosa looks, and I'll show you why. So here it looks bigger. Here it looks really tiny. What happened? Well, what happened is I planted it and they came. Within, I'll say, I guess this is probably June or July when the Asclepia tuberosa and incarnata came into bloom. The monarchs showed up. I didn't order them through the mail. They just showed up. I'm not even sure how many butterflies I even noticed before I noticed that these plants were covered with monarch caterpillars. So if you watch the little video there, you can see there were, my granddaughter and I counted, at one point there were upwards of 15 monarch caterpillars munching away. And they're, you know, they're really laying waste to this plant. I had the groundskeepers not go into this area at all. Do not spray anything. These are welcome insects. Leave them alone. And they got a kick out of watching. Look at this little guy go. I mean, he's just really going to town here. So as you know, monarch and no butterfly has a mouth part. They have the proboscis and they only drink nectar. Adult butterflies do not have mouth parts. They don't eat. The only time that they are eating is when they are in the caterpillar stage. So what they are eating is, they don't necessarily need the nectar, obviously, from the plant. You can tell what they're eating are the plant parts, that milkweed, that sappy part, which makes them toxic and toxic to other animals. That's their protection. They get from eating the milkweed plant parts. And you can see they were everywhere. I didn't even get pictures. And the little rose bush is still there. That's the tuberosa, and they're down there as well. So within this small space, 15 monarch caterpillars showed up and made it their home. They got comfortable, they started eating, they stayed a while. There were, because there weren't even that many plants, I've never seen them eat the spent flower heads, the seed pods, before these seed pods dry and burst into all of those little fluffy seeds. Actually, the monarchs were there eating the seed heads. And what came later were these beautiful, they look like jewelry, these beautiful little pendants, I call them, hanging from all of the little areas in that corner. They were hanging from everything. And every few days, one would come out. They probably, maybe 2 weeks, and then they would pop open and we'd stand back and watch the monarch would hang all day long while its wings unfurled and dried out. And then they would fly off to another part of the garden where the echinacea were, and they would sample. So, as I've said multiple times, if you build it, they will come. Or if you plant it, they will come. But it's not, you have to get used to bringing in the plants little by little. And it does happen. You do get more used to having the native plants, the style, the aesthetic may be different than what you're used to. So it's an adjusted aesthetic, right? This is a picture of our native Pachysandra. This is Pachysandra procumbens. It grows at a slower rate. It's not as aggressive, but it's a ground cover that if you have Pachysandra and you're looking to make small changes, you might want to try a native Pachysandra. What you'll find if you look around your garden is you probably already have many, many natives, but you just didn't know it, or you maybe never looked, or you might be in the process of maintaining other plants and spraying them because maybe they're near roses and you're trying to keep, powdery mildew or black mildew, whatever that spot diseases that roses get. You might be spraying roses and not realizing that you're also spraying the pollinator plants and pollinators. So we often like flashier things like the European Pachysandra, or it might be Asian Pachysandra. We like it because it's shiny, it's pretty, it grows fast, it covers an area, it takes the weeds out. But with a little patience, this grows, and there are other ground covers, and there's the benefit of that it's not as aggressive. To me, that's a benefit. Why do we like the showy things? I went out and planted Aquilegia, Columbine, and this is what I planted. And I thought, oh, it's beautiful. I have a native plant. But the truth is, this is the native to our area, Columbine. And you can tell just from the shape of the flower who loves it. Well, hummingbirds. This is almost like an indicator plant. When the Columbine opens up in spring, that's around the same time that the hummingbirds return. So this plant is co-evolved with hummingbirds and other pollinators. So when it opens up, you can start expecting the hummingbirds. I don't think the hummingbird is going to be as drawn to this. First of all, you can tell from the shape that it's not that appealing. Here you have the long spur on the back, and you can just see a little hummingbird bill fitting into that. The color, everything says what it is and says what it's for and who it's for. But we're drawn to this. This is what they love. I love this plant. This is, of course, the showy Dicentra spectabilis, but this is what they love. And you can see the bee is already going near it. This is Dicentra exemia. This is the more delicate woodland version that you would find in a woodland setting. It does well in shade. It's partially ephemeral, but the bumblebee, which is probably an early arrival, knows just how to bumble his way right up into these little tubes and get what he needs in a garden that hasn't fully awakened yet. There is something there for this early arrival. And I have tons of hostas in my yard, and I've learned to little by little plant this and not that. And guess what? The deer so far, and I know deer will try everything, and I'm just experiencing deer. I did not have them for a long time, and they've kind of made their way around to my neighborhood. So I'm okay if they want to nibble the hostas because they don't bother the astilbe. They don't bother the tiarella too much. Now, other people may have other experiences with this. I understand that deer will browse anything or eat many things that I'm just not aware of yet. But so far, maybe it's because I've left the hostas, they aren't bothering these other beautiful edging plants. And if you guys have ever worked with euchera, you know it comes in a variety of colors. It is the Baskin Robbins of plants. There's a color and a shape for everybody. We love our roses, but they are high maintenance. They're high maintenance plants, and there are native roses that we can plant. Some of them are, they get a little weedy, but I believe they're the roses that you will see pollinators on. In this this is the Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden, which I'm sure you guys recognize from the New York Botanical Garden. And I'll tell you, I've volunteered in that garden for many years, and honestly, I remember getting bitten by thorns, but I don't remember ever seeing any bees or anything around there, not even birds. It's sprayed regularly to keep it beautiful. And the samples and specimens in there are gorgeous. And some of them have the most lovely fragrance, but they might not be very practical for a pollinator garden or for a home garden if they need to be sprayed. So consider some of our less showy and often still fragrant native roses. So back to the garden of how we're planting it. We're planting it in layers, right? We're thinking of spring blooming trees for early color. Also, spring blooming trees are beneficial to early arrival bees and those small larvae that the birds are feeding their young ones. So an early bloomer that you might not consider a showy tree is the red maple. It's a big tree. We don't think of it when we think of our dogwoods and our magnolias. We don't necessarily think of Acer rubrum, our native red maple, because it's not showy, but it actually is one of the earliest blooming plant of any kind, and it blooms way up in the canopy, and it's a real blessing to early arriving pollinators, bees. So we think of then some of our understory shrubs. This is probably a 20-year-old mountain laurel. And when I see this plant, it screams the Northeast to me. It's the plant that everyone had probably in their backyard when I grew up. Wasn't in the front. It was usually, as it was planted in this yard by the owners before me, it was on the side. It's on the side of the house. The thing is probably 12 feet tall. And it's just a big tree that is very nostalgic to me. It really, to me, creates a sense of space and place. I know where I am when I see Kalmia latifolia or mountain laurel. My mother was not the gardener. My dad was the gardener. But even the first time my mother walked through my yard, she goes, "Oh, you have a mountain laurel." And I don't ever remember seeing that woman with anything other than cut flowers in her hand. But she recognized this because it was a tree that reminded her of her childhood in her home. And, it's just one of those sense of place type of shrubs. And they do make a smaller one recently, Kalmia Tinkerbell. It's a smaller one, and I believe it is beneficial to pollinators. I just like this big old girl here. And then we think of ground covers, right? This is false Solomon seal growing with that ostrich fern, which is very aggressive, but it's a great ground cover if you have space for it. So I know we're going to talk more about flowers, but just keep in mind the shrub border can act as a backdrop for your plantings. A mixed border is lovely here. This acts as a screen for a golf course behind it. It's a mixed border. There's clethra. It's in the foreground of, this is a Norway evergreen, a Norway spruce. The landscaper felt, well, the deer won't bother it, and deer are a problem in this area, but wasn't my pick. Anyway, but there are other native shrubs here. There's high bush blueberry back here, beach plum. They act as a backdrop and a screening. The backdrop for the perennial garden in the foreground. And also there are berries galore. If I can't get a blueberry off of this thing before all the birds get it. And I think I got one beach plum once. And in the fall, the beautiful berries, there's Ilex verticillata back there as well, winterberry. And it's a beautiful little pop of color in the fall with there's oak and pine with these big green Norway spruces, but it adds a little bit of color in the fall garden when most of these shrubs that are deciduous have gone by. So as I said before, I love hydrangea. Hydrangea arborescens. It's one of our native hydrangeas that have these open flowers, these cap flowers that pollinators do love. But with a shrub border, think of mixing it up. Try a little bit of everything. Here's clethra, and here's the winterberry, the Ilex verticillata, sharing space. And in a mixed border, I think they play well together, and they bring different seasonal interests. The clethra you'll have in the summer, and the winterberry you'll get in the fall until the birds get it. And there are shrubby perennials too. Ampsonia, I love it. You'll get that beautiful spring color. And then I love the color in the fall. This is a threadleaf Ampsonia, but I believe even the straight tabernaeum gets a nice fall color, but the fluffy threadleaf, I love the way it looks, just like little clouds of this yellowy green in the fall. And we do have some native evergreens, arborvitae, although I do believe that's the one that deer like. Of course, we have hemlock, and hemlock has to be treated. We're losing them to woolly adelgid. This is my favorite. This is Tsuga canadensis. I love it. It is the weeping hemlock form of it, and I do have to have it treated, but I love, this is who I call my cousin it. If you're transitioning away from privet and boxwood, there are small cultivars of Ilex glabra or black inkberry hollies that you can kind of get that privet or that boxwood feel from. Sometimes I think that some of them are more evergreen than others. I have one that kind of loses some of its leaves, but not all of them, but it's much bigger than this. And then there's our native holly, our big holly, the Ilex opaca. These don't particularly like windy conditions. They should be a little sheltered, but they're great. They're, tall, they get the berries, and in tough winters, once it's gotten cold and thawed a little bit, those berries become palatable to the native birds, and they will go through that thing like Grant through Richmond. They love the berries on this, but they have to be frozen and softened up before the birds go for them. And of course, three of the most pollinator friendly and important trees are the oak. This is the river birch. So the oak is beautiful to me in any time of year. And I love that this is a young one, but it holds on to its leaves. It's an odd tree in that it holds its leaves and they just become brown, but they stay on, so you can always identify it in the forest. The river birch, you can't beat the bark on this. I mean, it's beautiful. This is a tree that I planted in my neighbor's yard. We share a driveway, and she had a white birch there that died. So I asked, did she mind if I planted a river birch, and we named it Betty for Betula nigra. And I love it in the winter. It just brings winter interest. And then this is the Cercis canadensis, the eastern redbud, and I like it in the fall as well. So let's look at some natives and for the native perennials. And like I said, you guys, if you're transitioning to a native garden, if you haven't already, you probably have these plants, some of these natives in your garden already. This Coreopsis and Echinacea, which is everywhere. So I know I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys probably are already have many of these plants. Our native iris, beautiful iris. It's planted here in my backyard with the peonies. They open up around the same time. I love them together in a cut flower arrangement, but I didn't dig and throw away my peonies. I love them. They were here when I moved in and I love them. And I left the hostas, but I do love these irises because honestly, I had tried irises years ago, the non-natives, and they wouldn't take in my yard. This native iris went crazy. I love it. I was able to divide it and move it around. This is a like this little guy, this iris fulva. I like the color. It's just different. It does not spread as prolifically as this one, but it is an interesting iris for those who collect irises. Look for height and whimsy in your plan. This is Rudbeckia maxima. And what I love about it is after all of these Dr. Seussy whimsical flowers go away in early summer, these dried heads are just found gold for tiny goldfinches. You will find them bobbing around on the heads of these seed heads of these spent flowers, eating all day long, and they just wave in the wind with these tiny birds perched on top of them. Looking for light and airy things to open up your garden. Zizia aurea. I like this one in cut flower arrangements too. Look how it ages beautifully. And I spray painted when I'm doing a floral arrangement in the fall, and I need like something gold or shiny for a Christmas arrangement, which we do with senior citizens. Our garden club does with senior citizens. You take the dried heads, and once they are spent, bring them in, let them dry out completely, and spray paint them gold and put them in arrangements. It's very pretty. Here you get the effect of the light airiness above plants that have heavy basal foliage, and then you have something to draw the eye up, let light in, open up, and create space in the garden, a visual sense of space. So we're remembering texture and contrast, right? When we put all these plants together, this is a sort of a wet garden. You'll notice the cattails to add the verticality. Joe Pye weed, it's tall, but it has, you know, a wider, it contrasts, this flower contrasts with the cattail flower. Echinacea, which is always in a native garden. We have some contrast. I don't remember what this was, but it has a grassier texture. And then the Rudbeckia that's still pumping along. And this is a later season picture in a park. I think one of the Bronx parks. So plant a lot. Variety is the spice of life, right? The more variety in the garden, the healthier it is, and the more different types of species of anything you attract. Many of these plants are host plants for specific types of bees that are specialists and only go to one type of plant. So the more you plant, the happier you make your whole community. And we love this vine. This is our native honeysuckle. It's not as aggressive. It's also a little shrubbier, so it doesn't cling and grab and pull on trees. It forms a shrub that you can kind of train upward. But if you look at the shape of the flowers, who loves it? Hummingbirds. And if you're hosting for monarchs, host a party. The Asclepias tuberosa, incarnata, syriaca, oops, let me go back. That's a little less lovable to me because it's very big, and but this is what you'll find in roadside ditches, and this is an important plant for monarchs as well. And it's important to those roadside ditches, which are often havens for a lot of birds and different species that have kind of been pushed out of developed areas. They kind of thrive on the edges of the road. So when you see this growing along the edge of a road, it's a good sign. I like this cultivar. Cultivars are still in question whether they provide the same benefit. This was a cultivar of incarnata, Asclepia incarnata. It's called the ice ballet. I loved it. It bloomed. The pollinators loved it. It just was short-lived. I found that I only had it about 3 seasons. It didn't last as long as the other ones. Whether it reverted or was pushed out, I don't know. But I realized that after about the 2nd or 3rd summer, it was gone. So keep in mind the late bloomers. This is Solidago. It's a Solidago canadensis fireworks. Now, if you say Solidago canadensis, people run for their lives because it is very aggressive. But these plants that form monocultures late in the season, it's important for late season pollinators. So when they see that explosion of yellow, they know there's something for them over here. And this plant in late September, October, before it fades away is covered usually in late season bees. Grasses do their thing, especially the panicums in the fall. I love it. I love the way this panicum, I think this is heavy metal, panicum heavy metal. It has a sort of a bluish cast to it, but I love the way it plays with the spent flower heads of the Rudbeckia. So we think seasonally, right? We think of our garden, we compose it so that we have beautiful music in the spring, in the height of the summer, the colors, and it just it intensifies as with the activity. And then in the fall, we still want to be able to look out of our windows and see something, and late season pollinators still want to be able to come out of their space and find something to eat. Do quickly ground covers. This is one of my favorites because it is an aggressive native, and you will not get weeds in this, but this is Pachyra aurea, or I think it's golden groundsel might be the common name. And there are white wood asters, another aggressive one, but it's, I don't mind it and let it run and do its thing. And you have to plant a plant that can stand up to it in its space. Some plants will get overrun by it, but you can really, some ferns will stand up to it. This is an Antenaria or pussy toes, slow grower, but a beautiful soft texture. And then Geranium maculatum. Gets a little taller, but the purple flowers in the late spring, early summer are beautiful, and they'll blink on and on, off and on throughout the year. And this is the runaway ostrich fern that I just kind of let do its thing, but sometimes it can push out other flowers that you want. Ground covers do not have to be solid mats of anything. Put low growing things in together around the base of your plants to fill in. This is a new planting, so it'll take a while, but I just kind of put the phlox in without thinking how big these ferns were going to get. And when I saw what I got, I was kind of happy with it. I thought it was a nice little happy community that they'd formed there together. The ferns look very welcoming of that phlox. And this is in a shady area in a side yard. So we have all of these different woodland plants, and some of them, like the wood poppy, appeared on its own. There's a sensitive fern there popping in that came up on its own. Sort of like I put this little community in, and some plants that might have been dormant in the seed bank in the soil just showed up and said, well, the coast is clear. And they popped up and started filling in some of the spaces. So where I might have thought these plants would form a nice community, Solomon seal and one of the lower growing phlox, Jacob's ladder. There are tall phlox that come in the summer. This is a spring picture. I thought they would play well together. Some of the other plants that have been waiting to break through and be welcome just appeared. And now it's a happy little party in that space. And this is a lovely ground cover. I do very little weeding in this space. So when we close our gardens down, I want to point out that there's a reason why native gardens are considered messy and why people might shy away from them. It's not the plants. It's what you learn about pollinators. You start to learn that less is more. So you do a little less maintenance and you let the garden get full. You don't blow leaves out of it as aggressively or rake them out during the season to keep the mulch showing and to keep everything looking neat. The garden looks messy because you realize that if your garden is there not only to please you, but to please the wildlife, you've got to not over manipulate it. And you'll drive past someone's house and you'll think, that's why I don't want a native garden. That thing is a mess. Well, you could, if it was in your yard, you could neaten it up and make it a little bit neater. But once you begin to really embrace the idea that this is not just your garden, but their home, then you kind of let things go a little bit, not out of neglect, but out of letting things live and letting the all of the little critters that live in the leaf litter and everywhere else, letting them exist. And remember, any garden, whether it's a native garden or not, if you have good bones, it's a great garden. And thank you. So if we have any questions, I'm all done. I'm gonna stop the share.
Okay. All right, Jacqui, it's Adrienne. I'm going to share some of the questions that I have here.
Okay.
Here's one. The black-eyed Susan seem to be planted in clumps behind the iris in the White Plains parking lot garden.
Mhm.
Please explain why clumps rather than a bank of color.
Well, some plants, I think the answer is some plants are clump forming. I think that as that is also a very new garden, it may spread out to look more like a row over time, but usually when you're buying a Rudbeckia or an Echinacea, it's in a clump. That's some plants are just clump forming. I think I'm not sure if I'm answering that.
Yeah, I think that's clear. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, here's my next question here. What is tilth? That you have that slide on the slide
Tilth
early.
is the health of your soil. So if a plant has good tilth, when you pick it up, it's rich. If you squeeze it, it doesn't form a tight lump, but it might be crumbly in your hands. So tilth is the health and the texture of your soil.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I just wanted to let everyone know that it is at the 11 o'clock hour. So if you have to go, we will hopefully be posting the recording. And for those who can stay, we can finish answering the questions that are in the chat. And we hope to see you next month for Stopping the Tree Snatchers. And I think okay. One more slide. Just want to thank our supporters for your donations, and your tax deductible gifts help us support our work. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing now.
Okay. I have just a couple more questions for
Okay.
Jackie, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, so someone had a question about what are native roses? What are the types?
Oh, I can go back to that slide. If someone, I know that it's being shared, recorded, but if you like, you can also screenshot by pressing on your laptop, if you're on your laptop print screen, and it will show you, you can take a picture of the slide that has the names. I believe it's Rosa virginiana, Rosa carolinia, Rosa woodsii. But let me go back to that slide. So you can see they're not the petals. You get the 5 petals that are indicative of something in the rose family. You can see all of the parts of the roses are a little more defined, and there's not they're not bred to have all of those petals.
Yeah,
So,
they're more open.
Yeah, they're more open. And I find that with the native roses, sometimes if you see them growing along a beach, you will see that the rose hips in the fall are absolutely beautiful. They're bigger. They're actually in some cases prettier than the roses, in my opinion. They look like apples. I've had people stop and ask, what is that, a tomato plant? Or, mini apple? What is that? And they're the rose hips that come in the fall when the roses have gone by.
Yes, yeah, that's right.